Welcome, everyone. My name is Julene Jackson, and I am the National Vice President for Moms for America. Thank you so much for your patience this morning. We had a little bit of technical difficulty with all the ice storms and power outages and snowstorms that are sweeping this country, but we are here. We are resilient. We are tough. We're enduring well, and I think we're going to have a fabulous class today. So welcome. We have finished our seminar number 1 last week, God's Hand in Building of America. And we talked about these beautiful people, Joan of Arc, Christopher Columbus, the Pilgrims, our great father of the American Revolutionary War, Samuel Adams, and the genius of Thomas Jefferson to write this Declaration of Independence. And then the courageous leadership of George Washington to get us through this 8 miserable, hopeless looking at times Revolutionary War. And then we talked last week about the miracle of the Constitutional Convention and how Benjamin Franklin, the oldest little delegate at 81, had to stop the convention and plead that they begin to pray because they needed God's help. It looked like the convention was going to break up. And then the preparation and the intelligence of the youngest delegate at the time, James Madison, who went on to become known as the father of the Constitution. So at this point, 39 of the delegates have signed that Constitution, and now they have to win over the hearts of the people in the states so that they will ratify this new government that these delegates in Philadelphia produced. And over the course of 1 year, articles were published in newspapers in the 13 states explaining every detail of the Constitution. And they were written in the form of the Federalist Papers. So it was James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay that published these articles with the pseudonym explaining to them and winning the hearts of the people. And sure enough, a year later, 9 out of the 13 states were able to ratify it. And the following year, all the states ratified it. George Washington was sworn in as the president, and we're off. We're off under a new government and a new leadership. So it's interesting, a couple years ago, and I actually see my husband on the call today. Oh my word, he's never sat in on one of my classes. It must be because he's missing me. I've been away from him for a few days. Hi, sweetheart. But Al said a couple years ago, he went to a dinner of about 300 people of conservative, patriotic folks. And the keynote speaker, my husband was traveling with the keynote speaker, and the speaker said, "How many of you love America?" Yeah, the crowd cheered. "How many of you love our founding fathers and the Constitution?" Yeah. And then the speaker said, "How many articles and amendments do we have in the Constitution?" Whoa, there was a few, 7, 27, 20, 28. And then he said, how many amendments did our founding fathers give us? Oh, complete crickets. And so it just underscored to me, how can we uphold and defend something that we don't really understand? For instance, look, last week we saw the trial of a former President Trump. And because enough people have said that, Congress is somehow able to do this, that this is constitutionally sound, we just kind of blindly believe that this was acceptable. But when you really begin to understand even the basic premise of these 7 articles and these 27 amendments, you no longer have to just blindly go along by what legal scholars are telling us today. So the United States Constitution is the oldest written constitution that is still in use today. And it is one of the shortest, only about 7,000 words. The structure is really simple and straightforward, if you will. It just establishes the 3 branches of our government, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. And it creates a system of checks and balances so that no one branch dominates the other. And this is really what defines our American government. So today we're going to study just the very first article. I hope everyone has been able to get this book, The Charter of Freedom. So this is the Constitution from the viewpoint of the founding fathers, what they intended. There are 7 articles. We're just going to study the very first article today, which establishes the legislative branch. They wanted this legislative branch to be the preeminent branch, even to supersede before they established the presidency, because they believed this legislative branch would be preeminent in the American government because it was going to derive its power from the voice of the people, and it would keep that spectrum of power squarely balanced in the center, the voice of the people, helping us to swing into anarchy or tyranny if the voice of the people always held the majority and was the preeminent voice in dictating how the government was to operate. So anyways, this is just a clever little tip. In order to remember the 7 articles, I have used this acronym for years, and I've taught this to my children, leg cessar. It doesn't exactly flow off the tongue, leg cessar. But if you will write that down at the top of your book, you will always be able to remember the 7 articles. And they stand for, leg cessar stands for legislative.
Can you flip the chart, Julene? We can't see it.
Oh, I'm sorry, you can't see it. How's that? Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, so legislative, thank you, sweetheart. Executive, judicial, states, amendments, how to amend the Constitution, the supremacy clause, and ratification. So if you will write leg cessar, is that backwards? Leg cessar?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Leg cessar. That will be a good kind of hack tip to remember the 7 articles. So just today, we're just going to study the legislative branch. You know, there are many Americans today, I would say the majority Americans, that don't have the slightest idea how the founders arrived at this formula for constitutional government and how that has made America so successful. Remember, when we were formed, we only had 6% of the world's population, 7% of the land mass, but within 100 years of working under the Constitution and these free market principles, we were producing over 50% of the world's wealth. Now, politicians today that are elected into office, I think, are well-meaning and hopefully patriotic and love America, but they seem to lack the founders' wisdom. Maybe they haven't studied it, they didn't learn it in school, and maybe they haven't even learned the concepts of prosperity, economics, these free market principles. So these next 4 lessons in this second seminar, the Charter of Freedom, is going to highlight the founders' formula for free and prosperous America. Now, I'm going to have to go really quickly through the Constitution. And so there might be some points that just don't make sense to you or seem kind of obscure. So I want to recommend to you a book called The Making of America. And I have a true confessions. I'm in Puerto Rico, staying with a girlfriend in her beautiful home. And I didn't lug all my books. Otherwise, I would show this Making of America, which you can get at the Moms for America store, or you can go to kimbercurriculum.org. And I will show you this book over the next few weeks. But The Making of America takes every line from the Constitution and explains what the founders meant. And it will give you 10, 20, 30 quotes from all the founders explaining what each section and each clause, so you understand what their thinking was behind the Constitution when they wrote it that way. You can also, if you go to the Thomas Jefferson Center, you can watch the 12-hour full seminar. I think it's $50, and you can go through the 12 hours, and they really go through and fill in every blank for you. So if you just note that after we go through this seminar, if you feel like you need a little bit more study, I'm going to share with you some of the study guides I use, but there are some really more in-depth resources if you want more clarification on something. So we get to the preamble of the Constitution by Gouverneur Morris. He was a delegate from Philadelphia, and the preamble is just like a little introduction to the Constitution. And he was a great writer, so he kind of polished up that writing, and he wrote the preamble, which identifies the benefits of living in America, really 6 benefits. And so a part of our little devotional in the morning is my little girl who's 13, while she's eating her oatmeal, and we study the scripture a little bit. I teach her a principle of the Constitution from the 5,000-year leap. We review the headlines to see if the principle of the Constitution is being adhered by what's going on in society today. And she has memorized this preamble. And there are hand motions at the back of the book, at the back of this seminar, that helps you to teach your children or grandchildren the preamble of the United States. So we, the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, like the Lady Justice. We ensure domestic tranquility. We provide for the common defense. We promote the general welfare, and we secure the blessings of liberty, like Lady Liberty, here's our flame. We secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, little stair steps to children. We do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So for the longest time, I've taught my children to memorize the preamble by using those little movements and those hand motions. I know it's silly, but it works, mothers and grandmas. So every day, little Marie, she has advanced beyond the motions now. And so she just has that memorized. But imagine that the whole purpose of this preamble was to guide the legislators and the courts, to remind them what their role is, and it's contained in this Constitution, and also to remind us people of our constitutional rights and privileges. I dare say it's worthy of memorization if you can, and to teach your children and your grandchildren. So Article 1 essentially just sets up Article 1, Section 1. Now, might I tell you, this article is the largest article with the most sections. It has 10 sections in this one article. Now, under every section, they have paragraphs, and those paragraphs are known as clauses. So in Section 1, if there's 5 paragraphs explaining Section 1 of Article 1, they will be called Article 1, Section 1, Clause 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So each paragraph is called a clause. So that's kind of how it's organized. When you see these cited in legal briefs, this is how they cite it according to the article, the section, and the clause. So in Section 1 of Article 1, it just establishes the House and the Senate. And then in Section 2, it establishes the structure of the House of Representatives. The House was meant to be the wing of compassion. They want to solve problems. House members are elected every 2 years. So they have to hurry and try and solve problems, get the goodies back to their state, so they will be reelected. So they're problem solvers. You have to be at least 25 years old, and you have to have been a citizen for 7 years, and you have to live in the state to which you represent. So the youngest, it's interesting, the youngest member of Congress today is 25 years old. His name is Madison Hawthorne. He is the young gentleman that is in a wheelchair. Have you seen him? He was just elected a few months ago. He was in an accident in 2018, which paralyzed him. And so he is run for office. He's the youngest member of the House of Representatives, and he actually spoke on January 6th at that historic, shall we say, controversial, some people like to say, rally in front of the White House with President Trump. I was there, and I was so impressed with this young man. So a census is taken every 10 years to see the population of states. And depending on what the population is, a state is, determines how many members of Congress, how many members of the House of Representatives that state gets. So they capped the number of representatives in 1929 to 435 members. Otherwise, we would have over 10,000 members of House of Representatives, because as our population goes, gets higher, we add more representatives. So they capped it. There's only 435 members of the House, which means about each congressman represents today about 700,000 people, okay? So every 10 years, you might see, like the state of California might lose a representative because the population has gone up in Michigan or some other state. And so the number members of Congress per each state might change every 10 years based on the census evaluation. And so moving along in that section 2 in our Article 1, there's an important clause that talks about how the House of Representatives is the one, and this pertains particularly to us recently, the House of Representatives are the ones that initiate impeachment proceedings. So that means that lower house makes an accusation of wrongdoing against the president with the intent of removing him, but the House has no authority to remove him. They can just call up and initiate an accusation of wrongdoing. And then it is the Senate, which is known as the upper chamber, that actually conducts the trial. And that is what we saw last week. Now, it's interesting, in recent years, President Clinton was impeached in '98 by the House, but they did not have enough votes in the Senate to actually remove him or convict him. Same with President Trump. He was impeached in 2019 and 2020, but did not have the necessary 67 votes, 2/3 of the Senate, to remove him, to convict him. And so in section 3 of Article 1, it outlines the structure of the Senate. And the Senate is known as the wing of resources. So they're supposed to actually ask, wait a minute, can we afford this? Can our state afford to pass this legislation? Who's going to pay for it? And is it really necessary? Does it infringe upon our rights? So when Thomas Jefferson, he was away during the Constitutional Convention. He was a minister in England. So when he came back and he was talking to George Washington, and he wanted to know, why are the senators in for 6 years and the House members are only in for 2 years? And George Washington explained to Thomas Jefferson this way: it's like pouring legislation into a saucer to cool this hot tea that comes out of the House. The second chamber needs to kind of like cool it off and let it simmer and let like cooler heads prevail, because they're only elected once every 6 years. They can really ask the hard questions. Well, wait a minute, we do want to be the savior to everyone and solve everyone's problems, but is it really necessary? How much is this going to cost to enact this legislation? So this is why senators aren't as beholden to a special interest, they shouldn't be, or to people, because they're trying to determine, this is the wing of resource, can we really afford this? And you will see there was a disruption of this check and balance when the 16th and the 17th Amendment were passed. And now senators are elected not by their state legislature like our founders were intended. And we will discuss this more as we get to Amendment 16 and 17 and as we get into the third seminar. So anyways, a senator has to be 30 years old to run, has to be a citizen for 9 years before he can run and live in the state to which he represents. And the Senate doesn't choose its presiding officer, because it's always the vice president is the presiding officer in the Senate. You will see that oftentimes the Vice President Pence will have voted to break a tie, or Vice President Harris will do that now. So we don't typically think of the Senate as a judicial body, but it becomes one when an impeachment hearing is being had to convict. So we just saw this last week right before our eyes. The Senate has the exclusive responsibility of determining the guilt in an impeachment trial. So it says in this third section here that the Chief Justice must preside over this hearing, which is so interesting, women, because Chief Justice Roberts refused to do this last week because he knew what they were doing was unconstitutional. You don't have a trial to remove someone from office who is already removed. Former President Trump was not the sitting president. So what they were doing was not constitutional. And Chief Justice Roberts refused to preside over this trial, which might be your first clue that what the Senate was trying to do was unconstitutional. Okay, so section 4, 5, and 6 of Article 1 pretty much just spells out the procedures for operating the House and the Senate. And then section 5 talks about the rules of order, what makes a majority, what makes a quorum. Section 6, so remember there's 10 sections in this first article. Section 6 talks about the compensation for our congressmen. So if you remember back during the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the states did not pay for their delegates to go to Philadelphia to be a part of this Constitutional Convention. In fact, some of them had to borrow money. James Madison had to borrow money to even be able to participate, the father of the Constitution. So our founders, when they were forming the Constitution, decided that the House and Senate members should be paid out of the US Treasury. The current salary for House and Senate members is $174,000 a year. And this salary has not been increased since 2009. So interesting enough, that money compared in the private sector today is lower than most mid-level executive or manager positions. So $174,000 is certainly much higher than, the average. I think the average person makes $44,000 a year. But living in Washington, D.C. for the last 20 years, I have seen that might be a struggle to live because these senators and congressmen have to maintain a house and a property in the state in which they reside. Plus, they also have to maintain a house to be able to live here in DC and do the work in Congress. So my husband and I have known many members of Congress through the years because they didn't bring wealth to the position. They live in their office and they have a pull-out sofa that they sleep on, and they shower at the Congress gym, and they use the public bathroom around the corner from their office. So, in a way, I think that's good that it kind of comes at a sacrifice. We don't want them to make too much money. The founders did not intend for them to be career politicians. And so they make that salary. And according to the Ethics and Government Act, they're only allowed to make 15% higher than their congressional pay, which might come in the form of a book royalty, but unearned income such as stocks or interest or dividends are not subject to that 15% rule that says they can't make an additional income higher than 15% of their $174,000 salary. So they could make $30,000 more on maybe books, or that's primarily how members of Congress make additional money. Now, it's interesting if you really kind of drill down and question, well, how do some of these long-term members of Congress, how are they able to live in multi-million-dollar homes if they have only been making, $170,000 for 40 years? Like maybe a Maxine Waters out of California who lives in a $4.3 million home, but has pretty much spent her whole life working in government. You might ask some of these questions. Even President Biden was known as one of the poorest members of Congress, and he served for 47 years in government, but owns several multi-million-dollar homes. So, you wonder sometimes if some of these career politicians have profited maybe from their political connections that they've made through the years, but they're not intended to get wealthy, and they're not intended to make it a career. The founders only wanted you to serve for a time and then get back to your state. And so that is their salary for all intents and purposes, whether you're sympathetic for them or you think that's a lot of money, they shouldn't be paid that much, maybe just depends on where you live. But anyway, so section 7, okay, we're into section 7 now. There's only 10 sections, so hang in there with me, ladies. 10 sections of this Article 1, we're on section number 7, talks about how a bill becomes a law. Do you remember that Schoolhouse Rock video in the morning? Kids would watch the Saturday morning cartoons. I'm only a bill. on Capitol Hill. Well, if you pull that up, that really is how a bill becomes law. And it's kind of a slow, deliberate process. And our founders intended it to be that way. Now, bills involving money can only be initiated from the House. But needless to say, bills not relating to money can be introduced in the House or the Senate, and then it's given a number, and then it's appointed to go to the appropriate committee, and it will die there in committee unless the person who is sponsoring that bill has enough support within the committee, and then they will vote it out of committee, and then the bill will go to the floor where it will be publicly argued, discussed, and amended, and finally voted on. And then it's sent over to the other house to go through that same process. Now, if the other house amends or changes that bill, it has to go back to the original house, the House or the Senate, wherever it originated from, and it has to go through that process of modification of bill, of modifying it so they're all both on the same page with the changes that they've made. And then the bill cannot go to the president until both houses have approved it, the identical bill. And then once that bill arrives at the president's desk, he has 10 days to consider it. And if he doesn't take any action, it automatically becomes a law. But if he objects to any part of it, it has to go back to Congress, the House and the Senate. They have to hash out the differences, or that member or Congress can override the veto if they have 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate. Then they can override the president's veto. So that just makes me tired telling you about it. But you can see it should take a lot of time and effort to shepherd a bill through that legislative process. And that's exactly what the founders wanted. They knew that a free people needed to be governed by the rule of law, and it was going to be slow, and there was going to be hashing out and differences to get the best law, the best legislation, instead of just quickly rushing it through because you got a charismatic person who's introducing it, and it's going to be done behind closed doors amongst leadership, and bypass all the committees and just have a vote. And we have been seeing more and more of that. And what you get is bad legislation when it bypasses some of these processes that the intenders had in place for how to make good legislation. Okay, so girls, we're on to section 8, which is kind of a famous section because this is what enumerates the 20 powers that the states were now going to give to the federal government. Now, remember, we almost lost the Revolutionary War in the beginning because the states didn't give enough power to Congress in those little flimsy Articles of Confederation. So now we're going to see what the states were willing in the Constitutional Convention to delegate to the federal government. And these are known as the 20 enumerated powers in Section 8, the 20 duties that members of Congress specifically have given to them. So number 1, are we ready? Number 1, first duty of the Congress is to tax. And it talks about how Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, to pay the debts, to provide for the common defense, and promote the general welfare. And these taxes would be uniform throughout the United States. So if you go back and see what the founders meant by the word uniform, they meant taxes to be assessed fairly, no excessive taxing of some or redistributing to others. And so what happened early on when that general welfare clause was put into the Constitution, it was meant to mean that the government had the ability to carry forth its duties, and that these funds from the government were not meant to be spent for individual states or individuals or special groups, but it was to provide for the general kind of commonwealth of the government. Now, Alexander Hamilton, if you remember, had some different ideas, and his little feelings got hurt, and he left the Constitutional Convention. at one point, but he did come back because he really did do some great things. But he actually said, well, I think the general welfare should just give Congress the power to spend as they see fit if there's a problem. And Jefferson and Madison were vehemently opposed to that. And that concept by Hamilton never got any traction. But something terrible happened in 1936 called the Butler Case, where the Supreme Court kind of ruled in favor of this idea that Hamilton had thrown out, 150 years earlier, that the government can tax and spend money for whatever causes it considered beneficial. And what happened because of that Butler case, the Supreme Court case in 1936, it opened the floodgates for the US Treasury to really virtually fund anything that the Congress deemed was a good idea. Now, Ben Carson, remember, he was the Secretary of Health and Human Services under Trump. He wrote a really interesting book about this, and he said uniformly is like a tithing. A tithing is a fair assessment. Whether you're rich or poor, everyone pays the same amount, 10%. But because of that Butler case ruling of the Supreme Court in 1936, they did not really understand what the founders meant by this uniform taxing. They began to adopt a graduated income tax, meaning that if you had more money, you should have more ability to pay more. And what that actually did was violated the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment, because with this graduated income tax, if you make more, you should pay more. It made the income of wealthy less sacred, and it wasn't uniform, because now you have some having to pay more than others. So power number two that Congress has is they can borrow money. Now, Jefferson, they knew that to borrow money against the next generation, Jefferson said, was actually indecent and immoral. And isn't it, imagine what they would think about this third round of stimulus checks that are going out now, $1.9 trillion a package. So credit is defined as a trust in one's integrity in money matters and the ability to fulfill these obligations. But there are two factors that seriously damage the credit of a government, and that is when we're in excessive debt. And did you know that we're almost at $30 trillion, our debt is? And when our currency is unstable. And that means you see a rise of prices, and it erodes our purchasing power as we keep printing money. The value of our dollar actually goes down. Our founders knew that the burden of debt was destructive to human freedom as actually subjugation by conquest of someone invading our country. Being in debt was just as dangerous as a foreign invasion. And so, and once again, as we study, how do we allow us to get in $30 trillion debt? Well, some of these checks and balances were changed from what our founders intended. So we can reinstate, the original intent and make these corrections if enough people understand it and hold the feet of the fire to the feet of our politicians, or get people that understand the Constitution from the viewpoint of the founders in office, or maybe you ladies run for office. And so I know it seems like an overwhelming task, but God in heaven said he will heal our land if we do our part. It will justify him to intervene. And so that's why I'm so hopeful that as we learn these things, when we learn what went wrong, we know how to fix the problem. And so let's keep hope alive. Power number three that Congress has is to regulate commerce. Now, remember, this was there was only 3 compromises in the Constitutional Convention, and this Commerce Clause was one of those compromises. And what it means is the federal government can regulate commerce within foreign nations and among, not within the states, but among the several states. So what began to happen when the Constitution was formed was some of those southern states didn't like those northern states, and they were holding back some of their crops, their cotton, their tobacco from the northern states. And the northern states didn't think that was fair because they couldn't produce some of the products that the southern states. And so the northern states said, okay, we'll give you 20 years to phase out the slave trade if you will allow the federal government to regulate commerce. And that was two of the three compromises of the Constitution. But what has begun to happen with this Commerce Clause through the years is that it is the clause has been expanded to give Congress power to regulate our national economy. And this came through a series of Supreme Court decisions during the New Deal, Roosevelt. And then we saw it played out most recently with Obamacare, when individuals and companies were mandated, they were forced to purchase this health insurance, which really goes against the Commerce Clause, because it says that the federal government can regulate amongst the states, but they can't go in and tell you what you have to buy and what you have to participate in. And so actually Obamacare was taken to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court declared it in 2012 unconstitutional. So in recent years, the Supreme Court has tried to rein in this Commerce Clause that has been misinterpreted, through various erroneous court decisions of the Supreme Court. So we're moving on to Power 4. Congress can establish rules of nationalization, immigration. Power number 5, they establish rules of bankruptcy. Power number 6, they're to coin money and regulate the value of money. And we have strayed from this power number 6 because we came off the gold and silver standard. We abandoned that standard in 1933, and we're going to talk about the problems that have come from that in our third seminar, The Unhinging of America. Power number 7, Congress can fix the standards of weights and measures. During the Revolutionary War, there was fraudulent representations of weights, and so they set this standard for what a pound is, or a mile is, or a gallon is, just to promote healthy commerce. Power number 8, to provide punishment from counterfeiting. We're going fast through these now, girls. Power number 9, Congress is to establish post offices and roads. Power number 10, they're to grant copyrights and patents. And there's some interesting things I could tell you about some of these powers, but I'll let you study that out, or you can always call me later and we can have a conversation about it. Power number 11, Congress is to establish federal courts beyond the Supreme Court, the district and appellate courts. And we'll talk about that next week when we talk about article number 2 from the judiciary. Power number 12, Congress can punish piracy, felonies, and offenses against nations. Power 13, did you know, Power 13, it is Congress that is supposed to declare war, not the president. And since the Korean War, there's been kind of this struggle between president and Congress to find the right balance between this role of the Congress and commander-in-chief when it comes to war. But remember this, that if the president declares war and Congress is not happy, they can ultimately end that war without the consent of the president, because Congress is what funds the wars. So they just defund the war and the war has to end. Power 14, Congress has the ability to establish rules dealing with captures on the land and sea. Power 15, they can raise up and support armies. The House changes every 2 years, and they're the ones that fund things. All the bills and legislation that has to do with money comes out of the House of Representatives. So they only appropriate enough money every 2 years for the military, because they didn't want, our founders didn't want the president to be able to build up this huge stockpile of the military and resources and maybe overtake or the military to overtake existing presidents. And so, but it's still good. Obviously, we need to have a military even in peace times, otherwise we would be viewed as weak around the world and we would maybe invite trouble, sneak attacks and so forth. Power 16, Congress has the power to raise and maintain a navy. Power 17, remember they only have 20 powers, so we're getting close to the end of what members of Congress can do according to the Constitution. Power 17, it is Congress that is supposed to call up the state militias to protect the citizens. So when you see the National Guard being called up, it's either the governor who is calling it up within his state, or it is Congress. It is not the president. The president cannot call up the National Guard. Now, unless, and I'll tell you how he can do that, but the National Guard can be called up by Congress to suppress an insurrection. That is a word that we're hearing a lot nowadays, insurrection, civil strife, or to repel an invasion from a foreign power. That means maybe if there's at the borders, a lot of illegal people are entering, we can call it the National Guard because that's deemed as an invasion. And also they can call it the National Guard, Congress can, to execute the laws of the US. So a governor can call up his National Guard if there's like for flood control or search and rescue or riots within the state. But the president cannot call up the National Guard unless he gets a special granting of permission, a waiver called a posse comitatus. So it's a special permission that Congress or the governor would give the president so he could then empower the troops under his command, but still Congress would have to pay for that activation. So it's interesting, in the inauguration a few weeks ago, Congress called up more National Guard to be present in Washington, D.C. than soldiers we had in Afghanistan and Iraq combined. We had about 25,000 National Guards, more than what we have in most of the Middle East, and Congress initiated that. So that is under their control, under Congress, which I had kind of forgotten that. Power 18, they have power, Congress does, to place the seat of government as a neutral zone. So they, within a 10 by 10 mile radius, they didn't want Washington, D.C. to be political, but that was kind of deteriorated and overthrown with the 23rd Amendment that was passed in 1969 that gave the Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, some electoral votes. So in Washington, D.C., Mayor Muriel Bowser, she is a very politically charged mayor, and our city council. And so we really have gone against what our founders intended it, the seat of federal government, to be kind of a neutral zone when we passed that 23rd Amendment. And we will talk about that as when we get to that amendment. Power 19, Congress has the ability to establish federal lands within a state. Now, this power has been misconstrued and compromised because what you will notice, Congress was able to purchase lands with the consent of the state to erect federal forts or arsenals or dockyards or other needful buildings. But what has happened with, as the years went on and new states, these Western states came into the Union, the federal government held a large percentage of their land. If you look at Alaska, by the time Alaska was admitted into the Union, the United States holds 96% of their land. And that is unconstitutionally being withheld from the state of Alaska. Just look at like California, 45% of the land of California belongs to the state government. In Nevada, 87% of the land mass of Nevada is controlled by the state government. And this really has caused certain states not to be on equal footing with some of our earlier Eastern states that, the federal government owns like 1 or 2% of their lands. And in the Northwest Ordinance, and we'll talk about this at some point, this was passed the same year the Constitution was written. This Northwest Ordinance in Congress said that all states were to come in on equal footing. And this has been a violation with some of these states, that the federal government owns an excess amount of land. So really a part of healing our land would be a simple solution, that the governments would sell this land either back to states or to private individuals, and they could decrease the deficit, this $30 trillion debt. Imagine if they sold even half of the federal lands that they own, how they could eat into our deficit, and how it would also benefit the economy of some of these states, that what they could do with some of this land that's just being held up by the by the federal government. So this is a violation to some degree of, and you will see Western states are always talking about this. Every state legislature usually has some sort of bill trying to get back, in these Western states, get back some of their unconstitutionally held land by the federal government. Okay, we're on power number 20. And this is their last duty that Congress has been assigned to, and it is called do whatever is necessary and proper, the necessary and proper clause. And this was just given to help Congress to execute these 20 duties. And so what the founders meant by necessary and proper, in order to perform this act, we have to, be able to have some flexibility that's needful, and proper is virtuous, that we expand our powers so that we can execute some of our other duties. But what has happened is it's known as the elastic clause, because it almost allows Congress to do anything they want under the necessary and proper clause. And some scholars will say, this is an important clause if you consider this document a living document, a living constitution. But some people might say, well, okay, if it's a living document, why are we trying to kill it then by misinterpreting it, by changing it, by not following it, by passing laws, statutes, and courts passing or rendering judgments that are completely opposite to what the original intention of the Constitution states. And so we sometimes get into trouble if courts misinterpret what is necessary and proper under this clause here. So Section 9 talks about the powers that are supposed to be denied to Congress. And Section 9 is interesting because it says, it was part of the compromise, that it said, okay, Congress for the next 20 years cannot place any restriction on slavery. Slavery was one of the three compromises to get this Constitution written. And so they had 20 years, it says in Section 9, to figure out how they're finally going to stop the slave trade in 1808, is what it says in the Constitution. Now, it was the consensus of the convention at the time in 1787 that slavery was on its way out. Even in the South, only about 1 out of every 17 households owned slaves. But these slaves were considered property, and most of them were mortgaged to European banks. So if they would have freed the slaves down in the South at the time that they were building this republic, it would have put these Southern states in an economic peril. So they gave them 20 years to figure out how to begin to phase out slavery, and 20 years they were going to stop the slave trade. And so, and the northern states were willing to compromise because they wanted that commerce clause put in there, so the South couldn't deny certain crops to the northern states. So there you have the compromise of the commerce clause and the slavery clause. Now, I've recommended this to you before, and I think my husband got off the call, but he has given a really wonderful presentation that explains founders and slavery. If you go to the Thomas Jefferson Center for Constitutional Studies, he talks about how the founders viewed slavery, and he even talks about that 3/4 clause, which is in Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution. And I didn't talk about that when we were going through it, but this 3/4 clause is, as you have heard through the years, many times has been twisted and misconstrued to say, oh, the founders didn't even consider slaves to be a whole person. They only counted them as 3/5 of a person. And the founders, it had nothing to do with placing value on human life. And it had everything to do with limiting the representation that the Southern states would have if they counted slaves as full people, because it would mean that they would get more and more members of Congress, the Southern states in, and they could they might have to stop the slave trade, but they could continue on with the existing slaves that they had. And so the founders devised this counting method to limit the power that the South might have if they counted them as full members. And if I could just say this last little clause, and we're almost done, ladies. Thank you so much for hanging in there with me today as we try and figure out the Constitution together. But Clause 4 of Section 9 says that the federal government cannot assess an income tax, a head tax. And so there was no income tax when our country was first formed, and until 1913, when the 16th Amendment changed all that. And boy, we have problems today because of that. But so how did they get their money then? What they did is, if your state made up like 3% of the population, then your state was responsible to pay 3% of the federal budget. And the state, the governor and the legislature determined how they were going to tax the people in the state to come up with their percentage to pay their allotment for the federal, for the budget. And so you can see that as that changed with the Butler Case and the 16th and 17th Amendment, we started, the federal government now started assessing and telling people how much they had to pay, and some had to pay more than others. This really did put us on the road to a socialistic form of government, where the government got bigger and bigger and bigger and encroached more and more into our lives. And we'll talk about that in the third seminar. Okay, Section 10, the last section of Article 1 of the legislative branch, talks about the restrictions on the states. And we won't really go into too many of those. You can just kind of read them. Nothing too controversial there, I don't believe. So girls, we did it. Woo! Do you feel like you understand that first legislative branch, Article 1 of the Constitution? We discussed the 20 primary powers that have been assigned to the federal government, Congress. And like I said, many of the responsibility and power of the legislative branch, they have given to the courts to decide, or they give it to the president to determine, and it's caused a disruption of balance of power. And we will discuss Article 2, the executive branch, and Article 3, the judicial branch, next week. And then the third week, we'll discuss Articles 4 through 7 and the first 10 amendments. And then the fourth week, we will discuss Amendments 11 through 27. Now, that just makes me tired thinking about how quickly we're going to go through our Constitution. It really is kind of record speed, but can I just give you a few helps that I have used? It's called the Catechism of the United States Constitution. It was written in 1828 by the name of Arthur Stansbury. And he published this little catechism on the Constitution as a way to teach our children about the preeminent parts of the Constitution and our government. And this was taught in all the schools in the elementaries starting in 1828. And Alex de Tocqueville came to America about 10 years after, and he was amazed at how the children knew how to read. They were so literate, and they were taught out of the Bible. And he was amazed how so many people in this new country, this new democratic republic that had been formed, it was an experiment. No other nation had ever operated the way our country had. So Alex de Tocqueville from France came over, and he wanted to see what was going on. And he was amazed at how many of these young children understood their government. And it's because these kids were being taught out of this catechism for decades and decades. So I would recommend getting this little book. You can get it on our Moms for America store. It's only, I think, $10. And I just go through, like at breakfast time, sometimes in the summer, we'll just go through a page, and it's written in the Socratic method, where you ask your kids questions about the Constitution, and then they try and answer it, and then you have a discussion. So this is a great way to teach your children the Constitution. Also, girls, you begin to keep a pocket Constitution in your purse and just begin to get familiar with the organization of the Constitution. 7 articles, 27 amendments. I'm going to have Vivian. I have used this one-page outline of the Constitution for years, and it outlines the 7 articles, kind of what the sections are about, and it gives just a couple word description of the 27 amendments. I have used this little resource more than I can tell you. So we're going to send this out as one of the resources, or if you want to just text me right now, I will send you this file and you can have it right now. Remember my telephone number, area code 240-338-5737, and I can email you. It's in an email form. And I have some other books, but I just don't have them with me because I'm on travel right now. But, you know, sisters, what you're going to begin to understand as we study the Constitution from the viewpoint of the founding fathers, we're going to begin to understand what they intended. And we can then better discern when we're listening to the news or scrolling through our social media feed or reading the newspaper, we're going to realize, wait a minute, that's not what the founders intended. They're going against the intention of the Constitution. It's important to remember that only 15% of the Constitution has been changed and altered through the years. So 85% of the Constitution is still intact. But we can't reinstate something that we don't really understand. And this is why we're studying it together as mamas, to help each other understand it. I'm not a constitutional scholar, maybe you are, but as you get women coming together who love this country and are praying to God to help us understand, and we're studying it from the viewpoint of the founders, he accelerates our understanding and our learning. And I've seen it happen as I have studied the Constitution in cottage meetings around the country through the years. The Constitution, I believe, really will be one of the tools that God uses to heal this land. And it will be you and it will be me and those that understand the Constitution from the viewpoint of the founders. We will be the instruments, the tools that God will use. Remember, our founders said this Constitution was struck off by the hand of God. It was the divine hand of providence that they were able to do what they did. And so, and we know, and prophecy says in 2 Chronicles 7:14, God promises he will heal our land if we will turn to him and humble ourselves, and if we'll turn from our wicked ways. And women, I really do think some of our wicked ways is just apathy. You know, we don't know the Constitution. We think it's boring. We don't see how it applies to us. We're just kind of ignorant about it. I'm not saying you are, but most people are. They're just lazy. They'd rather watch Netflix than study a little bit of the Constitution. And I think that offends the Lord, because the founders knew that this inspired document came from the heavens. In fact, remember, Thomas Jefferson said that they were going to be eternal principles. He somehow knew that what he was writing was going to carry us on into the eternities. So by what you are doing, by learning and seeking to understand these correct principles of government, I believe with all my heart, it is going to justify the heavens to intervene, and God will help us to heal our nation and our neighborhoods and even our marriages and our families as we study this Constitution from the viewpoint of our framers. So girls, I hope you're not overwhelmed. I hope you're thinking, this is boring. This is not for me. I hope you've caught something that you're like, yeah, I think maybe I do need to understand this. We will study next week Articles 2 and 3. So we're going to talk all about the presidency, what has gone wrong there, and about the Supreme Court, the judiciary system, what has gone wrong there, that we expect the courts now to not interpret the law, but to make law. How has that happened? So girls, thank you so much for your patience. We started late today because we had some technical difficulties, but thank you for being with us, and we will see you same time, same place next week, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.